the app on the computer and explain that it has a dyslexic font intended.
I'm a reading researcher, and I'd like to add some information about what exactly the experience of dyslexia is like, some of the research with dyslexic fonts, and why a dyslexic font might be helpful. Here's a researcher's simulation of what it's like to view a text if you have dyslexia. Now, dyslexia is something that happens in varying degrees between 10 and 20% of the population. And looking at this text, I can imagine how frustrating it would be for every time I needed to read something to have to struggle this much. Not all forms of dyslexia are the same, and everyone's experiences are different. So here's another simulation. Again, makes it very difficult to read. The idea with dyslexic fonts is that the letters are somewhat different, even if they have similar shapes, like B and D or P and Q have slightly different bumps in them, so they're easier to identify. Also, the spacing is a little bit wider in order to allow for faster letter identification, word identification, and then easier reading. So what does the research say? Well, here's one study that showed that having that extra spacing is helpful. There's also some evidence that people with dyslexia prefer larger fonts, and that also might be because then with a bigger font, you inherently are going to have bigger spacing. However, I should note that most of the research done on dyslexic fonts has not found a benefit. In fact, this study found that there could be a detriment if you have one kind of spacing within another. In other words, if you have bigger letter spacing, but you don't have bigger word spacing, which makes sense because then people have difficulty determining what's a space between a letter versus what's a space between a word. It's important to note that most of these studies looking at dyslexic fonts don't have big samples, and that's not shocking. If you're a kid with dyslexia struggling to read what you have to read, you're not going to leap up for the opportunity to participate in a research study to do extra reading. We also know from studies from readers who don't have dyslexia that the effects of font tend to be pretty small, even when they are there. So it's too soon to say conclusively that a dyslexic font is helpful or not helpful, and individual differences vary. Ultimately, researchers are mostly looking at the average effect for the average person in these quantitative studies, so individual differences, of course, are going to vary. If you find that this font helps for you, use it. If you have dyslexia and you haven't tried this font, give it a try. If it comes built in with the app, you have nothing to lose by trying it out. Finally, another accommodation that may be really helpful for people with dyslexia that does have a pretty clear research evidence base is the use of audio-assisted reading. In other words, having the student listen to the text as they are reading it.